interest. And they put handcuffs and they say, no, my rights to trade are actually more important than your regulation. So literally the trade agreement will dictate how legislators and regulators are allowed or not allowed to regulate the operation of foreign corporations in their own country. So far from accomplishing the widely popular reforms of the tech sector, which are urgently needed, trade rules would inherently give corporations more rights and inherently place limits on public regulation that should be expanded. Okay? So this is why having rules on big tech in a trade agreement is not the same as having binding global rules on the digital economy written by and for tech for its own benefit. These are not e-commerce rules. They go far beyond e-commerce and will result in the liberalization of all aspects of the global economy. They really represent a new constitution for the digital economy of the future. Now, ensuring that technology is deployed to serve the well-being of humanity and the planet and our shared prosperity will only be possible if we as citizens exercise our democratic rights and prevent big tech from rigging the rules of the future global economy to increase their own private control and profits. And imagine the impact on developing countries. To take advantage, for example, of digitalization and e-commerce, a country needs to have, for example, a high level of technological sophistication, a high level of internet use and access to electricity, payment systems, a functioning postal system, functioning roads, regulations like consumer rights, and they need to have a strong productive capacity. Now, if developing countries open their economies without improving their productive capacity, they will be swamped by imports, okay? Wiping out their small and medium businesses, their local businesses. They're not going to just start exporting by magic. So this is really a big threat to developing countries, but it's also just a threat to everyone around the world who is not a big tech CEO. Now, what's the alternative? There is a lot we could do around digitalization that would promote shared prosperity and that could be good for people and the planet. Now, in digitalization, we talk about the issue of data for the public good. How can we use data to solve the climate crisis? How can we use collective data to solve the COVID crisis? What if we could make sure, just a small example, that when Uber is operating in a city, that the data that it collects about how people move about cities, which is the most valuable asset that it has, it doesn't have cars, that data could actually be used for public policy purposes, for city transportation purposes. That's just one small example. Countries also need digital industrialization. What do we mean by this? The use of digital freedom for governments to be able to pass regulation in the public interest, to use digitalization to create jobs, to solve domestic economic problems, to increase access to and quality of public services, these kind of things. So there is a lot we need to do to stop the digital trade agreement from passing in the WTO, and Norway is part of that agreement as well. Now, just in my few minutes I have left, I'm going to just talk for a few minutes about, when we talk about how does trade affect me, climate sustainability. Now, let's start from the agreement that we all need all countries to be investing in green technologies in order to resolve the climate crisis. Okay, but we have three problems because of the WTO. First of all, in the WTO, you may or may not know that subsidies for oil and gas are not restricted in the WTO. Countries can subsidize all the oil they want, no problem. This affects trade, but oil is not usually included in trade agreements and it's not disciplined in the WTO, okay? At the same time, subsidies for green or sustainable energy are very restricted in the WTO. And especially restricted is the use of sustainable energy to create green jobs, okay? So as an example, India has a program to use the creation and installation of solar panels to both solve the climate crisis and the jobs economic crisis. Well, the US didn't like that. And the US took India to court in the WTO and said, you can't do this. You can't use green subsidies to create jobs and solve the climate crisis at the same time. The US won, okay? Now India is not allowed to subsidize solar panels to create green economy jobs. Well, guess what? The US, many states also have programs to use solar panel production and installation to create green jobs. India took the US to court in the WTO, and India won. So now the US is not allowed to do it either. The whole world actually needs both countries and everyone to do everything they can to support green jobs, but they can't because of the WTO. And the third issue is that the issue of technology transfer. So we need countries, developing countries, for all of us to solve the climate crisis. We need as many countries as possible to have access to green technologies, okay? But the WTO system reinforces patent and copyright, okay? Intellectual property. And so it's very difficult for countries to demand some of that. Now we have a global problem with fisheries, and this is my last point. What's going on with fisheries and the environment and the WTO? Well, rich countries have subsidized huge fisheries fleets, and now they're overfishing because they've invested so much that they literally have too much capacity for fishing. So there's a need to reduce that capacity and reduce that overfishing because fish stocks globally are failing, okay? We're wiping out all the fish in the world in an unsustainable way. This sector needs more global regulation. But in the WTO, the rich countries that have all invested in these huge fleets now want to say, oh, okay, now we're done. You all have to stop subsidizing. Well, what about poor countries? They need to have the right to expand their fishing capacity, to help poor people get access to fishing resources, to use their resource base sustainably. But they're being told right now in negotiations in the WTO that they should give up their right to develop, their right to catch food to eat for their hungry populations. They should give up their right to their livelihoods because everyone should stop subsidizing fisheries because of the environment. Well, this isn't right either. So instead of negotiating this in an environmental agreement or a development agreement where everyone would be on the table and you would have fisher people there and you would have environmental CSOs there and you would have experts, instead the countries with big fishing fleets took it out of those arenas and negotiations and took it to the WTO. No civil society is allowed to be part of the negotiations in the WTO. It's the only international instance agency agreement like that. All the other environmental agreements, other agreements, labor agreements, you always have civil society, including trade unions and affected communities as part of the negotiations. So it's people's right to live, to have a decent job, to have access to quality public services like healthcare and education for their kids, to have a clean environment, to have a positive future. These are the things that we all care about. We don't want trade rules coming in and dictating how we have to run our lives on the economy and the financial sector, but also in public regulation, services, agriculture, fisheries, climate. There's so many more examples we could give. Like we could talk about why the price of medicines is so high, at least in countries like mine. I'm from the US where we have to buy medicine. But we just, I think I've used up my time, so I'm going to leave it there. And maybe in the questions, we can also talk about how did it get like this? How do we get such a system? And what do we do to get out of it? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Now I will give the word to Kieran, and then we will have questions afterwards.
Okay, hello, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, thank you very much as well to the organizers for the invitation. I'd like to start by actually sharing a link, which I just put in the message box, because most of what I want to discuss, I hope that everybody, I think that only went to the panelists. Hold on a second. All panelists and attendees. What I would like to discuss is largely based on a study that I wrote for the German NGO PowerShift earlier this year, looking at European free trade agreements and their relationship to climate change mitigation, and assessing alternatives of how that could be, that objective could be better integrated into these agreements. So as I don't have much time, and also even the report itself is very condensed, I would recommend people to have a look at that, and even also to look at some of the secondary literature which is cited in the report, because some of these issues are incredibly complex. But I wanted to highlight some of the findings and some of the recommendations today. I looked mainly at European free trade agreements with Canada, Japan, Singapore, Chile, Central America, Colombia, Peru, South Korea, Ukraine, Vietnam, and CARIFORUM. So it was quite a broad survey of different generations also of agreements. But I think, as the other panelists have already mentioned, some of the problems can be quite easily identified in that the environmental provisions in European free trade agreements at the moment lack, and mostly they lack a lot of detail, and they mainly composed of voluntary and cooperative commitments. And these are limited in these so-called trade and sustainable development chapters, which are largely only subject to very weak enforcement mechanisms, which means that normally you would have a consultation and then a panel of experts and then a report, but then at the report things seem to kind of stop. And the second major problem, I think, with the EU's current approach is that they're not looking holistically at the trade agreement, but they're focusing all their efforts in these trade and sustainable development chapters. But then there are lots of other aspects of the agreements which have relevance for the environment, and they're just not considering these conflicts. So the report actually contains quite a lot of recommendations, but I summarized them in 5 points, which would be, I think also the other panelists have highlighted this quite well, that there's a drastic need to enhance public participation in the design of FTAs and their monitoring and enforcement. That's the first one. The second would be to ensure the primacy of multilateral environmental agreement commitments over commitments in the free trade agreements, and include more detailed commitments towards the environment. The third would be I specifically look in greater detail at technology transfer, support for renewable energy, and accountability of transnational corporations, and some aspects of that. I'm not going to be able to cover even half of that in the next 10 minutes, but these are things that are in the report. And also to contribute to reducing emissions embodied in trade, which is an issue within the WTO for quite complex reasons, but there's specific issues around designing trade measures which look particularly at carbon content, which is essential for us addressing climate change issues. And the final point that I tried to stress in the report is also about supporting the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, recognizing that we can't really design universal rules because we are dealing with states that have contributed differently to climate change and should take action on them accordingly. And the first main point, I think that's quite simple to make, if we look at the current approach to multilateral environmental agreements in EU FTAs currently, is that they mostly simply reaffirm what's in these agreements. So if you look at the EU-Japan FTA, there was a lot of fanfare around the fact that it refers to the Paris Agreement, but what it basically says about the Paris Agreement is that it's great and we should do it. But it's not very clear what that means. On the other hand, clarifying what that means is, I tried to explain in the report, also not that easy to do, because there are proposals, it's often stated that we can just simply import into the agreement a clause which commits the parties to ensure that their laws, policies, and practices are in conformity with the environmental agreement, which sounds very good. And it's also often proposed that that should be done through use of what's called a supremacy clause, which would mean that an international environmental agreement would take supremacy over the FTA if there was a conflict. There's a limitation to that, which derives not from trade agreements, but from environmental agreements. And that problem is that MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements, are often very vague in themselves. They don't often mandate explicitly action on trade. So if you're an adjudicator dealing with a dispute which has a very strictly worded trade commitment and a rather weakly worded environmental commitment, if you're trying to reconcile these two objectives, then it's very difficult to give primacy to a vaguer provision in an environmental agreement. And then in the report explain in a bit more detail why this is particularly relevant in terms of the Paris Agreement. I go so far as to say that, I mean, when it comes to effectively implementing the Paris Agreement itself does not know what the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement would look like. Because as many of you are probably aware, that the principal mechanism within the agreement are the nationally determined contributions. These are not uniform, they're self-determined, they're voluntary, and they're mostly quite vague. To give an example, I'm aware that some of them have been updated in the last year, but in the original round of submissions of the NDCs under the Paris Agreement, 152 of 189 of them contained only a 2030 emissions reduction target with no intermediary trajectory, which means if you're going to enforce a commitment like that through an FTA, for example, then there would be nothing, there's no measure to check what should be enforced, because you'd have to wait until 2030 to prove that somebody didn't get there. And so there's a lot of lack of clarity, which could also be addressed in the FTAs themselves. A second interesting point about NDCs, I think is important, is that a lot of them, although the Paris Agreement doesn't refer to trade expressly itself, it doesn't mandate action on trade, in the NDCs that states have submitted, there are a lot of trade measures. And the concern that these come into conflict with WTO rules is already widely anticipated, that once states start implementing these measures, such as import bans, subsidies reforms, technology transfer, environmental goods and standards, eco-labeling, these things, then these will be subject to challenge at the WTO. And I'm pleased that Deborah also raised the India case. I would also encourage people to look at this because it's quite interesting. I will return to that in a moment if I have time. But I also thought it's worth perhaps saying a little about border carbon adjustments, because this is a very topical subject. It's also included in the EU's plans for its Green New Deal, which launched last year. It was actually the only trade-related measure included in the proposal so far. And if you look at the relationship between the proposal for border carbon adjustments, which, if I briefly give a definition for people who are not aware of what they are, that would be effectively a tax or a tariff on selected imports aimed at tackling carbon leakage. So effectively trying to level the playing field between different jurisdictions with varying regulation of carbon emissions. The issue of BCAs and WTO law has been addressed by many, many scholars, because there's a lot of interest in border carbon adjustments, although none has actually ever been adopted as yet by a state. And because so many scholars have looked at the possible challenges to these, they've highlighted that to be compliant with WTO rules would also make the border carbon adjustments least effective. And I think this tension shows the kind of challenges that we have, particularly within the WTO, and the challenges of reform, because if you have states which are bound by these rules and they're trying to produce new regulations to address particularly carbon leakage, then their most effective tools would be prohibited under WTO rules. They could adjust them and make them fit to these rules, but then they would effectively not be as useful as we would hope, and then that would be undermining them. And the second point I would also highlight, it relates to what Deborah has already said about subsidies. As also another example of the vagueness of the Europeans' approach at the moment. There was a provision included in the EU-Singapore FTA, which refers to fossil fuel subsidies. And that would also seem like a positive, welcome development. But if you look at the provision, it also says almost nothing. It says that the parties share the goal of progressively reducing fossil fuel subsidies, but it doesn't explain how or why. And in the report, I tried to link the rules on fossil fuel subsidies directly to renewable energy incentives. And also one thing I think which gets often overlooked, and that is unilateral trade remedies. And I would mention, with respect to the WTO case brought against India that Deborah's discussed. Actually, I would read that a little bit differently. I agree that the prohibition of local content requirements, which effectively then was used to challenge India, and then India challenged the US about the use of these local content requirements. This tit-for-tat adjudication is not helpful at all in terms of developing like progressive climate change policy, and particularly renewable energy incentives. But at the same time, prior to the WTO challenge, India had adopted unilateral anti-dumping measures against renewable energy imports from the US, China, and Malaysia. And this had, according to some accounts, provoked the WTO dispute. And these unilateral trade measures also go under the radar at the WTO because the states are allowed to adopt them unilaterally. There can be challenges at the WTO to states that adopt these measures, but they're effectively increasing the price of environmental goods. And I think that this also needs to be integrated into our thinking about incentives and fossil fuel subsidies and subsidy reform from fossil fuels into renewable technology. And so I propose a variety of ways of integrating those. I don't think I've got too much time to go through all of them, but I think particularly in terms of fossil fuel subsidies is one of most examples on climate. You can see that these have to be addressed multilaterally, but bilateral FTAs could provide an experimental space and also a way of building, creating the building blocks towards a multilateral consensus. And on that basis, you could be more ambitious around fossil fuel subsidies provisions in FTAs, for instance, by including notification requirements. That's generally regarded as a crucial first step, because actually identifying fossil fuel subsidies is not as simple as it sounds. Types of subsidies are very disputed and there are different definitions. And there have been some recent methodologies developed for states to use to first identify and notify them, and then to come to an agreement on how these are phased out. Another aspect which I think is would be essential to properly integrate these objectives into a free trade agreement would also to ensure that those commitments to reduce fossil fuel subsidies come with commitments to mitigate the impacts on vulnerable communities, because we've seen in a number of countries over the last couple of years, including France, that changes to fossil fuel subsidies create exacerbate social inequalities if they're not designed in a way that also mitigate those impacts. I think maybe I've spoken for long enough, so I return to Tina. Thanks for listening.
Great, thank you so much. We are ahead of schedule, but I think we can start with some questions. One second. Yes, we will start. We have a couple of questions prepared, and then we have some questions from the audience that have come in. We can start. This is a question for everyone. How can people demand that their governments take responsibility for securing the safety of people and the environment when negotiating new trade deals? So I don't know who wants to go first. And I also have to say that Kieran has to leave the meeting at 1. So, but we still have Julie and Deborah with us after that. So Kieran, maybe you want to start first.
Okay, I'll start by immediately deferring the question. I think, I mean, I'm a legal researcher. I think it's a very, very important question. I also tried to highlight in the report that democratization of the process of creating free trade agreements is probably the most essential aspect of all the recommendations I made. I'm not probably in a position to recommend how that should be done, but so I'm looking forward to hearing the other answers.
Deborah, do you want to go?
Sure. Yes, I've unmuted myself. Okay, so this is, the million-dollar question. What can we do to be active, to hold our governments accountable? This is where we get excited and think about changing the system. So what I like to do is actually point out that there are individuals making decisions that led us to the system that we have. It's not inevitable. It's not guaranteed that it will continue. And we have to look at how they did it, how those corporations intervened, to then also get clues about what we can do. So I'm just going to give 3 quick things that they did. Number 1, they have a revolving door, okay? So what that means is that when corporations would like to see regulations changed in the regulator, they actually dispatch some of their top people to go and work in that regulator for a while and do the deregulation, and then come back and work for the corporations again. And we have a prime example of that right now, because Roberto Azevedo, who was the former ambassador of Brazil to the WTO, he was head of WTO for 7 years, and he's just left last week and secured a nice cushy corporate job as vice president of PepsiCo, okay? So he was involved in WTO's effort to help increase water privatization, and now he's working for Pepsi. So this kind of thing happens every day. Now, the trade policy negotiators are the same. They just go back and forth from trade policy, and this is something that we need to stop, okay? But these are individuals making individual decisions, okay? And they do a heavy amount of lobbying, okay? We have recent reports, for example, on the increase in lobbying by big tech around the time they got these rules promoted as US policy that then made it into policy in most developed countries around the world. It's astounding how much money they spend on influencing negotiations. Now, you and I don't have that kind of money, and we don't have that kind of power, but we do have some power. Now, let's take a good example. Trade unions and environmental groups from Uruguay, okay, small country, but they made a difference in the negotiations on another trade agreement that was called the Trade and Services Agreement, or TISA, okay? You might not have heard of it because it doesn't exist, because our coalition in Our World Is Not for Sale, working together with public services workers that are joined together in the Public Services International Global Union Federation, stopped that deal a number of years ago. How do we do it? Well, let me give some credit to the people of Uruguay. The environmental groups and the trade unions there convinced a number of their members of Congress, members of parliament, that this deal was going to be bad for them. And they also told other ministries, okay? Because a lot of times these things get negotiated in trade ministry, but your health ministry is going to be affected. Your environment ministry is going to be affected. Your fisheries ministry is going to be affected. Your agriculture ministry is going to be affected. And so you go to them and say, hey, did you know that in this trade agreement, you would be giving up your rights, your mandate as a democratically elected government to set the rules in this sector, because we will have traded it away in this trade agreement. And so they got the government to do an assessment of what the impact would be on all those different sectors. And it was amazing. Almost all the ministries came back and said, whoa, I didn't realize that this trade agreement is actually going to handcuff my ability to oversee the public interest in my sector. I thought this was just a trade agreement, but no, it has so many myriad impacts. And on that day that those ministries gave back, the government decided to leave the agreement. Okay, the agreement wasn't signed yet, but they decided to leave the negotiations. Now, this happens actually a lot, not that individual countries leave entire agreements, but it happens a lot that concerned citizens, if they band together and force governments to do assessments of environment and social impacts, that they can then use that with different ministries to say, we shouldn't be part of this agreement, or to change the government's position in negotiations. Now, this is what organizations like the Norwegian Trade Campaign, Spira, Attack Norway are doing all the time. They get active in the trade campaign, they educate more people, they write letters to the editor, they engage with their elected officials, they demand meetings with their trade ministries to say, this is what's in the public interest, boom, 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 not this crazy stuff you're trying to negotiate in trade agreements. So the basic message then is to say, we don't want new FTA, free trade agreements. We don't want expansion of the WTO. And I'm just going to mention one last issue because we haven't touched on it yet. And this is the issue of TRIPS, or trade-related intellectual property, okay? Intellectual property, this means patents and copyrights and things like that, right? So your patents on your medicine, your copyright on your music. These are intellectual fictions, okay? They are interventions in the economy in which monopolies are used to increase prices, which is supposedly the opposite of free trade. Free trade is supposed to be, getting rid of interventions, government interventions in the economy to lower prices and increase trade, okay? Intellectual property monopolies do the opposite. They increase monopolies to increase prices, okay? Why? Because patent holders are powerful people. And they have lobbied their governments to agree to have these interventions in the economy that raise prices, not 5 or 10% like a tariff might, but thousands of percents. This is why pharmaceutical industries are some of the most powerful, profitable industries in the world, okay? And they are actually stifling innovation now through these patent monopolies that give them rights to exploit or use certain patents for 20 years and more and more and more as they do something called evergreening. And it keeps us from being able to have access to better medicines that we could get from a more equitable, fair system of innovation, which is something that the organization I work for, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, writes about all the time. So I just want to say one last thing though, because we were talking a lot about how this is bad for us. What are ways in which we as people living on the planet or as consumers or as workers are harmed by these trade agreements? It's bad for us, food safety, climate security, democracy, economic fairness, you name it. But it's also bad for the global community. And when we talk about trade agreements, I think you don't actually want to benefit from the exploitation of garment workers in Bangladesh, or farmers in Senegal, or factory workers in Argentina, or mothers in the Philippines just trying to keep their kids safe from another climate catastrophe. We don't thrive at the expense of workers, farmers, fisher people, and the poor around the world. And that is another reason. I mean, it's not just for us that we have to stop it. It's really for everyone. So these things matter as to whether or not we'll live in a society that's increasingly unequal, insecure, unsustainable as it is, or can we get to a society that's more fair, more secure, more sustainable, and just? And the big difference is going to be if we can rein in that corporate exploitation power, and if we can lift up and make it so that our human rights, our environmental rights, our rights to health, our rights to public safety can actually become more important than the rights that corporations have gained through trade agreements to just expand trade at the expense of people and the environment. It's up to us to change it.
Okay, thank you. So Julie, do you want to give some thoughts as well?
Just agree with everything Deborah said. That was so many good points to bring. I think the most important is that we, of course, push for the rules, push for regulations, that we use every single opportunity and also create our own opportunities, because we're not always given it. We're not invited into these negotiations. We're not invited into these arenas where this is discussed. Often it's, like Deborah said, it's a democratic problem. Much of this is done in secret. So we have to demand to the insight. We have to demand to take part in these processes, which is really important. And there we need to organize, if it is in trade unions or if it is in organizations like Attack and Spire, to work for this, simply as that. And don't give up, to be sort of a pain in the ass for the different politicians, and also keep them responsible, because sometimes the politicians and the government are giving the responsibility to the companies, and not to say that they don't have the responsibility at all, because the companies sit with a lot of responsibility, they sit with a lot of power, but we also need to dare and be able to give them regulations and to set standards for those companies and have higher rules for them as well, So we can we need to have somebody responsible, because now it is also a big problem with just like, who is actually responsible? Who is to blame for the system? So we need to put that responsibility to different actors and keep them responsible at all times. And also, I think it's good to use different examples. If it is a case where Norway is involved, to use that and put it in into the global system, and use that to show the the mistakes and where the system has weaknesses, because then it's often easier both to get attention about the topic, to talk about it with new people that might not be that interested in issues regarding trade, and also for the politicians themselves. Yeah, I think that was, and also just to see the totality, to see the whole in most cases. Which consequences will this trade agreement have also for different people, for the environment, to try to always take 2 steps back and try to see the big picture in every agreement. Yeah, I will leave it with that for now.
Great. I will ask one more of the questions we have, and then we have a question for Deborah from one of the attendees. I want to ask you, what do you consider the main challenges in achieving trade deals where people and environment are not at risk? It's a difficult question, but who wants to discuss the main challenges in achieving these dream deals that are not harmful?
Julia, why don't you go first this time?
Of course, you are good at asking good questions, Tina. This really is a hard one. What is the main challenges? I think we have been talking about some of these issues. Of course, it is a lot with the democracy, that it's so much in secrets, that it's hard to know what we actually are negotiating. What is the details? And then it's hard to discuss with somebody that has much more information than you do. If we want to discuss a trade agreement with, for example, Norwegian government that they have with, to take the example with the Mercosur agreement that will be our own panel later today, it's hard for us to go into that and know every single details, because other parts are sitting with much more information. And that's something that makes it hard to take this. And yeah, and also, of course, who is to blame? Who has the responsibility? Because now it's switch all the time, which makes like, who are you going to actually go to change this? Who has the power on the top for these agreements? I will let you talk, Deborah.
Great. Yes, I agree that it is a challenge sometimes, and big corporations would like for it to stay a challenge and for it to be insurmountable, and for you to feel like you can't have any power, you can't do anything about it, no matter what, big finance, big tech, they're too big. Well, I'll tell you that the reason why we don't have global negotiations in the WTO on digital trade right now, and it's just a group of countries that broke off and decided to have their own negotiations that Norway is part of, but we don't have negotiations in the WTO because the Africa group stopped them, okay? And when I say the Africa group, I'm really talking about a group of about 6 negotiators in countries in Africa that really committed themselves to learn the issues, to study, and to stand up for what was right in the negotiations, even though it made them very unpopular in Geneva amongst their colleagues, okay? Because some of the other colleagues wanted to start the negotiations, so they have something to do. So people can stand up and stop these trade agreements. It is possible, and it sometimes happens when you least expect it, because we didn't actually expect to win that fight, okay? So we stopped those negotiations in December 2017 at the last ministerial of the WTO. That was a big surprise to all of us. We actually went in thinking that we were that they were going to be able to launch those negotiations in the WTO. And they didn't for all 164 countries, and that's why just a subset of countries is negotiating. So I would say, though, that on the national level, yes, it's very hard to know the details, but Norway is actually more open than many other governments. So Norway, the government there is more willing to share documents than many other governments around the world that don't give their citizens anything and that don't have any mechanisms of consultation. So I would say it's really important to use that transparency. You also have a very educated civil society, and you have support from trade unions. So, you know, your coalition is one of the strongest national campaigns on trade in the world. And that's something that you really want to take advantage of, because it's very exciting to be a part of it, because you can have victories. So in terms of, you know, what changes we should make, you know, I really have to point out that, you know, with COVID, it's been quite apparent to a lot of people some of the problems that our current trade system has. So we saw, especially in the spring, there were so much shortages of things like personal protective equipment and getting access to the right medicines. We're talking now about a race for vaccine, and you hear all these things about, well, countries are being competitive against each other, they're spying, or are countries going to work together in a cooperative way to share information and really to have the best outcome and make sure that it gets any sort of vaccine or treatment gets to the poorest people the first, gets to the people who need it the most the first, rather than just being exploited for corporate profit. And so we really need to, you know, use this moment to say, whoa, this just-in-time efficiency of global value chains broke down during COVID. This, you know, PPE to the highest bidder, that's not how it should work. It caused an explosion that we're all suffering from, but particularly the poorest at this time. And so it really exposes the stresses and fractures of an already weak system that was really built for corporations to be able to exploit the resources and not to have strong systems and robust systems of health around the world. And part of that is the trade agreements. So just really quickly thinking about what are the challenges to achieving these, well, we need to change some of the policies, and I'll just outline a couple of them. But several speakers, we've all kind of touched on this, the fact that all public interest issues, if you talk about everything people have fought for, what we get up in the morning to fight for, our public services, our human rights, our worker rights, our environment, all of these issues, many of which are in the Sustainable Development Goals, those should all come above trade agreements. And I think if you ask a regular person on the street, what do you think should have a higher legal precedence? A trade agreement in which a corporation has a right to trade in a foreign country, or my human rights and your human rights, or labor rights, or environment. Everybody would say, well, of course, the human rights are universal. I mean, they totally should be more important. And they're not, because the trade agreement is more enforceable, okay? And it actually even says in the WTO that if it comes into conflict with a multilateral environment agreement, an MEA, that the WTO actually wins, that it's the higher priority, okay? So we need to change that. We need to make sure and go back to the idea that all of us do have, that all public interest issues and our rights as citizens and as just people actually should come above trade rules. And somebody might point you to what they call the public interest exceptions in the WTO. So there is a few phrases that say that you know, governments are allowed to have, you know, rules that enforce public morals or human, plant, or animal health, and that nothing in the agreement can, you know, be bad for those things, or not be bad, but just that governments can actually use the need to protect plant, animal, or human health as a defense. But the issue is that countries take each other to court for alleged violation of the trade rules, and countries can use those exceptions as a defense in a case, okay? And they have 44 different times in the WTO. And in which number of cases have countries been successful in defending a public interest policy to protect public morals, plant, animal, or human health in the WTO out of 44 cases? 1. Okay, so the WTO adjudicators have always put the corporation's right to trade over those issues. And that's what we really need to flip, okay? So what would be some of the ways of doing that in the WTO? Well, we need to abolish TRIPS. There's no room anymore. I think it's very clear trade-related intellectual property rights have to go. We need to have a different system. We can have patents if you want them, but they need to be much shorter, reined in, and have a whole bunch of exceptions. And we need to have different ways of fomenting innovation. We need to transform the agriculture rules. We haven't talked about that much, but they are, when we talk about agriculture, the most important thing should be food security and farmers' livelihoods while we protect the environment. And right now we have a system that prioritizes trade in food over food security and farmers' livelihoods. And I can explain how that is, but that is the case in the rules. We need to put full employment first, okay? Now, it's interesting to note, and Julia pointed out that one of the main reasons for the trade agreements is to keep countries from fighting wars, which is very true. That was one of the main ideas, that if countries are more economically interdependent, they would be less likely to go to war, okay? This is in the aftermath of World War II. But also in the preamble of the WTO itself, it talks about the commitment to full employment and how trade can be an engine for economic growth and full employment. And then they go and outline all these trade rights for corporations, and they forget to check whether or not it actually promotes full employment, the rules that they've devised. So we need to say, no, full employment, that everybody has decent work, a decent livelihood, a decent way to make an income in the world. This is the most important thing. And trade can be a part of it, but under a different set of rules, okay? Because it has to be full employment with labor standards, okay? So abolishing TRIPS, transforming agriculture, full employment first, no rules on digital trade. I think I explained a bit about that already, at least, and I put a link in the chat box to a whole paper. It's almost a book that I just published on that. And I would say no deregulation, no disciplines on domestic regulation, no trade in public services for sure. And the last thing I would say is, how are we going to get there? Affected parties should be at the table, okay? Farmers from the global south should be at the table when we're negotiating a global agriculture agreement, okay? Workers from around the world should be at the table when we're negotiating agreements that are going to affect workers' rights, jobs, everything. Trade unions, faith groups, civil society organizations, development groups, academics, they should be at the table, because we're never going to have a fair agreement if it's only corporations influencing susceptible governments, and we don't have that counterbalance of power of the people who are actually affected by global trade agreements. So that's what we try to build together. Thank you. I think that's enough for me. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you. We have a comment from Helene, one of the attendees. She says, thank you for very interesting and insightful webinar. So that's nice to hear. We have a question to you, Deborah, specifically from Rolf in Fagforbundet, the trade union. Union. He asks, what do you consider the most dangerous issues for labor during domestic regulations?
I think this is really about the power imbalance, okay? I think it's really about the power imbalance, because if you look at the domestic regulation negotiations, they're all about shifting the role of government and giving foreign corporations a mechanism to influence how government regulates every service in your economy, okay? So that's why we say it's about the rules. So imagine if you and I are equal partners, and then I say, okay, let's have some rules, sure. And one party says, my rule is that you don't get to have input. And my rule is that I get to have input. I mean, it's just ludicrous when you think about it like that. So, the actual substance of which rules they're going to enforce and which rules they're they never say something like take away labor rights. They're never so blatant, right? Because they have to cloak this by saying that it's good for everyone. That's the only way they're able to sell it, is to say, oh, this will decrease prices and we all have a welfare gain and it's so great, and trade is just, more money for everybody. Well, it's not true, okay? Because there are efficiencies that you might gain by having a different country produce something. But then you're talking about job loss. And I'm sorry, but I think that the people who might lose their jobs, or the people who might have some of their labor rights taken away, should actually have a seat at the table in that discussion. And what you do if you agree to domestic regulation negotiations in the WTO, the rules, is you agree to take away that space that workers have in a government. I mean, that's the purpose of the government, is to say, well, here we have, experts, and we have workers, and we have parents, and we have service providers, and we have service users. And if we put all these issues together, what's the best for society? That is, fundamentally a simple version of what the role, like why we have a government, to regulate in the public interest, taking all those constituency interests into account. And what the domestic regulation does is it says the corporation, particularly foreign corporations, have huge mechanisms for input, and that you have to take their issues into consideration when deliberating domestically. That's not the role of government. The role of government is not to placate foreign corporations. It's to guarantee, a decent life for the citizens of the country, and to make sure that you're not harming others. But it's not, to placate corporations. So I think that is the fundamental issue here, is the power imbalance, and we need to be regaining that power. I mean, it's why, institutions like the International Trade Union Confederation talk about building workers' power, because we need to have more power for constituency group, for people affected, to be able to reclaim that space and say, no, government, you're not allowed to give away this deliberative space to foreign corporations. That's not what we're here for. So I think that's the main problem.
Great. I don't know, Deborah. Okay, sorry. Okay, we don't have much time left. We have a question from Caroline. She asks, how could new alternative trade deals look like that don't harm people and the environment? And I hope that you could sort of incorporate it into some closing remarks. If you have some remarks that you want to leave people with, what are the main thoughts people should leave here with? I think we were discussing before the meeting, we were discussing how people should feel they have some sort of agency in working for better trade deals. So I don't know who wants to go first of you. Julie, do you want to go first?
I can try to start. First of all, I think, as I said in the beginning also, that how trade is so important in every single case that we are working with, in every single topic. So sort of just to keep reminding ourselves that the importance of trade agreements and the whole trade system, which is so central in the economic system, which lies the foundation for the environment, climate change, human rights, and all of these topics. And I think from my own experience as well, that trade sometimes can seem a bit technical and seem like quite difficult to understand, and therefore also difficult to go into debates about it, or go into those kind of issues to talk about and try to change the policies as well, because it is WTO, it's all of these different agreements. Some are sort of the rules that's allows for the whole world, and some is just like the specific that particular agreement. So I think that for all of us that's here, it is important to know that even though there are so complex and complicated system, we don't need to know everything. We don't need to go into detail for every particular rule or regulation of how everything is working. The most important is to see the broader picture and to see how in the center trade is, and to use that when we are discussing other policies as well. When we are talking about Norwegian oil export, look into how the trade agreement is a part of it as well. And you don't need the details. You don't need to know for every single country, but to have the broader picture and to bring that up in other discussions. If we have a panel discussion about oil, if we have about food security and local farmers, about Norwegian aid, whatever, we need to bring the trade aspect in. And that is something I think is sometimes lacking in a lot of policies or a lot of political discussions. So that is sort of my number one thing that we all should bring with us. And yeah, I will give the words to Deborah and maybe think if I come up with something more.
Thank you. I think that's a great, great idea to leave people with. You don't have to know everything about trade. I'm going to give you one more example of how the proponents of these agreements actually dissimulate. I think lie is a shorter word. So when they do these economic modeling, and you might look at these economic models where they say, oh, we're going to gain so much from trade and it's going to be fabulous, and look at all these welfare gains, we're going to save so much money, it's going to be great. Well, first of all, as we said, we don't want to save money on clothes if it comes at the expense of a Bangladeshi worker feeding her children. That's not what we want. But second of all, I have to tell you a little secret about these models that they use to claim that all trade agreements are going to be good. There's two assumptions you should know about their models. It's incredible. Number one is that they assume full employment. Now, what I mean about that is that one of the main impacts of trade agreements is that they displace production from one site to another, and they move jobs, okay? So that you might have work here, more jobs here, less jobs here, okay? What's the net impact of the jobs? The trade agreements don't measure it, okay? Because it's one of the assumptions built into the model that they use to say everybody's gonna gain, is to not measure the impact on employment. This is ridiculous, because they constantly are saying that trade is going to create jobs, okay? They use that as their standard to say, oh, this is going to be good, okay? But their models are actually predicated on a loss of jobs. That's how you get cheaper prices, but they don't measure it, okay? So they won't tell you what the job outcome is going to be. The second thing is that when you lose tariffs from trade, okay, the tariffs are taxes. They're just taxes that corporations pay for the privilege of shipping and importing and exporting, right? So in a trade agreement, you lose, you don't have those tariffs, and they count that as a net welfare gain, okay? But then you're gonna have a cut in public services, or you're gonna have to make up that government revenue from somewhere. And the trade models that they use actually assume that you make it up from somewhere else, but that the economic impacts of making it up from somewhere else are not counted in the trade model. So they count the benefit of saving on consumer prices because of no tariffs, but they don't count the negative of because you have to pay a higher income tax, which is just crazy, okay? So this is just to illuminate the idea that you actually know a lot more about trade than you probably realize, and that a lot of your opponents who are spouting that trade is really good for everyone are lying, and they often have economic interests in making you think that you don't know what you're talking about, and they have economic interests in keeping trade policy the way it is, okay? But that can change, and they are, a lot of times, you know, we don't even say, oh, they believe that trade is gonna be good. Some of them maybe do, but a lot of them know exactly what they're doing, and they just don't care, okay? So we have to screw up our courage and raise our hand and speak up, because they actually are harming people knowing that they're doing it to make a buck, and that's not the kind of world that we want to live in. So you can make a change. Don't be intimidated. Get up there and speak. And I would just say in closing, because I know our time is up, that right now, you know, this is a long process, and people, you know, it'd be great to get more people involved. It's also really fun. We have a lot of wonderful people involved in trade justice movement and economic justice in Norway and around the world. But there are 3 negotiations that are happening right now that Norway is really participating in. And so I just give a special plug to kind of pay attention to these 3. And one of them is that I do think it's crazy that any countries are participating in the domestic regulation negotiations in the WTO. That actually might conclude by this year. Okay, they're actually trying to conclude the rules this year. They've actually finished the rules, and they're now negotiating to which services this would be applied, these rules would be applied, okay? So that's the kind of thing you can say, hey, government, what the heck are you doing participating in this? Get out, don't sign this agreement, and don't commit more of our services to this agreement, okay? The second one is digital trade. And Norway has been a participant in the digital trade, plurilateral it's called, in the WTO, and I don't really understand why. I mean, which of your corporations are really going to benefit from this? This is really an American project, and the Americans have kind of colonized the rest of the world in this to try to convince them that that's in their interest, and I really don't think that it is. And the third one is the fisheries. And because there is a mandate from the Sustainable Development Goals to conclude disciplines on fisheries subsidies, they are trying to do that this year. But the mandate from Sustainable Development Goals actually has development at its core. And what they're trying to do, as I mentioned, is use WTO in order to take out that development angle and to be able to make it so that those with big fleets can keep their first mover advantage, can keep their dominance, and that the smaller countries and smaller boats won't be able to compete ever. And they will lose their livelihood and they'll lose their ability to feed their population. And so that's really important. And I know that the Norwegian Trade Campaign has been very active on this issue, and I shout out to them and all their great work that they've done on all three of those issues. And I really just support all of you in your efforts to hold your government accountable. And it's really been a pleasure to share some ideas with you today. And I look forward to continuing the debates and discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to everyone in the panel and attendees. We're very happy that people wanted to come to this meeting. I just have to mention that we have another webinar this afternoon together with the Latin America group and Småbrukarlaget about the Mercosur agreement. So if people want to look at that, it's at 2:30, also online. So thank you everyone. Tusen takk. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.